Well, hello again, and welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV. Yes, thanks for returning to Classic Dirt Bike TV here on YouTube. And as you know, we're currently in the process of putting together all of the video clips and pictures that we captured at this year's 2025 Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show. But we've almost got it licked, as they say. So we're going to kick off with episode 1 of what could possibly be at least 8 half-hour episodes from this year's show. So as you can gather, we've got quite a lot of work to do between now and the end of Telford 2025. So let's dive straight into episode 1 and take a look at our first batch of motorcycles. Right, so let's get our Telford 2025 coverage underway by taking a look at Graham Noyce's 1979 World Championship winning RC 500 Honda, a bike that was certainly getting quite a lot of attention over the course of the 2 days of the show, and over the Saturday and the Sunday it was a bit of a free-for-all between the crowds to try and wait your turn to grab a picture or two of this bike. But thankfully I did manage to gain access to the Telford halls on the Friday afternoon when exhibitors were setting out their stalls. So it was a perfect opportunity for me to get some pictures of this iconic bike before the crowds gathered on Saturday morning. Now, as far as I'm aware, Graham Noyce doesn't actually own this bike in 2025, and the current owner, whose name escapes me at this moment, did bring the bike along so that both the bike and Graham could be reunited once again and try and recall that great day when he secured the World Championship crown while he was racing this RC 500 in what was then a full 12-round championship, with Graham's home Grand Prix at that time being at Farleigh Castle for round 8, which I remember Graham telling me that it was one of the toughest rounds of that 1979 championship for him, because with it being his home Grand Prix, he did tell me he was under huge pressure to win it, which of course he did to help him secure the world title for 1979. Now, also in that year, Graham Noyce was the first British-based rider to become world motocross champion since the great Jeff Smith achieved his world championship win riding his old BSA Victor, which was back in 1965. So it was a 14-year wait for British off-road race fans before they could see another UK champion. But nevertheless, I do remember the owner of this iconic bike telling me that each and every part of Graham's 79 Honda is still as it was from that year. And just beside the bike was this display cabinet here with many of the works factory components that were used on this RC 500 in that year. So not only is the bike a piece of British motocross history, we've also got quite a lot of the Honda factory parts that went with it. But I expect that if you're of a certain age and you've maybe been following all of the top motocross stars of the 1970s, then the chances are that you've maybe even been lucky enough to see Graham and his RC 500 in action on the track. But in this shot here, you can see more of the factory racing parts that were fitted to Noyce's 500, and this top triple clamp or top yoke for the forks was yet another bespoke item that was manufactured exclusively for this Honda. Now, on the other hand, you can see that in 1979 this World Championship winning bike had a pair of Swedish Öhlin piggyback shocks as its rear suspension system, which I expect would have probably have been the best shocks available for their time, and to complement those twin Öhlins, it was an all aluminium swing arm that was fitted rather than the simple box section steel one that was fixed onto the likes of the 250 Honda Red Rocket production bikes of that same year. But this is such an iconic motorcycle in terms of its history and its World Championship winning status, so we're going to keep this bike on the back burner for a little while, and sometime later in the year we'll revisit Graham's bike and we'll do a full in-depth feature here on my CDB TV channel, so that's maybe something to look out for in the future. So next up, it's this quite nice pair of, I think it's a 1980 or maybe even 1981 KTM 125s, which were another of the bikes that I managed to capture on the Friday afternoon as the guys were getting all their bikes in place just prior to the show starting proper on the Saturday morning. And you can visually see here just how much room that you've got to move around the bikes, which would be absolutely fantastic if you could film each and every bike in this way. But it's all thanks to the guys at Morton's Media, who very kindly supplied me with a press pass so that I could gain access to the facility during setup time. Now, of course, it's not every day that you come across one of these Austrian-built KTM 125 twin shockers, and we've got two here for the price of one. And I think I'm right in guessing that these pair of 125s were part of the 125 Twinshock air-cooled cup display that was here on the day, and we'll have a look at more of their 125 examples sometime later in this series of videos. But these smaller 125s were, of course, the baby model of the 1981 series of KTM Twinshock racers, because you also had the 250 and the bigger 400, and of course the mighty 495, who, as I remember, is still holding the record of being the fastest dirt bike ever when it clocked up a speed of 123.75 miles per hour, which was way back in 1981. And as yet, I'm pretty sure that that record still stands. However, it's still great to see these smaller KTMs still being used on the track, because these 125s are extremely rare nowadays, although they're still very competitive in the air-cooled 125 Twinshock series. So if you're maybe looking to attend any classic or even vintage race events during 2025, then there's a good chance that you might even see these bikes in action on the track. So anyhow, having all this lovely space in the halls was a good opportunity to film this immaculate 1972 380 Greeves Griffon, which again I think was part of the Greeves Riders Association stand, and because again this was early in the day on Friday afternoon, this was one of the first bikes that they put in place, but it would soon be followed by many other models in the Greeves range. So as you can see, this particular bike here is road registered, so it can be used as an off-road scrambler or even a vintage enduro bike as well. So if you're a Greeves fan, then you'll already know that these Griffons were the replacements for the earlier 1960s Challenger bikes, which of course were hugely successful during the 1960s, when many of Britain's greatest scrambles legends of their day could be seen riding those old Challengers at the BBC Grandstand's Winter Scramble series that was usually transmitted live on TV when the BBC couldn't film things like football matches because of the bad weather. So those old midwinter races, when you could watch these old Greeves bikes, normally covered in tons of mud and the riders knee deep in the huge ruts, were certainly a good source of a sports backup for live TV when all other sports events were being cancelled. So as I said, this is the 380 Griffon, which could easily be identified by these twin header pipes that ran over the top of the engine, because I think it was the smaller 360 that had just the single pipe. But as you can see, these Greeves Griffons also had a quite substantial sized barrel and cooling fin area, because quite a lot of these Griffons were exported to the USA as desert racers, and this large surface area of the barrel was to try and aid the cooling of the engine in those sweltering desert temperatures. However, if my Greeves knowledge is still intact, I do remember that you could have a choice of options when it came to the front suspension on these Griffons, where I think at the time you could have these conventional metal profile forks, or you could opt for the earlier leading link banana style front end that was fitted to the earlier Challenger bikes. But either way, both of these suspension systems were quite well suited for use as 1960s or even 1970s off-road motorcycle suspension systems. And again, back in the 1970s, the bodywork and things like the fuel tanks on these Griffons were all manufactured in fiberglass, and you could certainly have them in all kinds of exotic metal flake colours, like sometimes blue or gold, or as in our case here, a quite nice fiery red. But I must say, this is a fantastic example of a 1972 380 Griffon, and for me it's one of the first ones that I've seen being registered for the road use, which I can imagine would be quite a nice little trick looking bike to throw around, whether it was being used on a vintage scrambles or enduro event, or maybe even just to go for a ride on a nice sunny summer afternoon. But nevertheless, these are another couple of classics that are spotted on the Greeves Riders Association display on the Friday afternoon, and these pair of beauties here are Ian Hodges' 1961 250 Greeves Hoxton and his 1966 MX3 Greeves Challenger. A lovely pair of old timers from back in the day, and immaculately restored, I might add. So let's just first take a look at Ian's 250 Hoxton, which was, I think, given its name by Greeves to celebrate Brian Stonebridge's emphatic victory when he rode his Greeves at Hoxton Park back in 1957, which was, I think at that time, powered by just a simple 197cc Villiers two-stroke motor, and Brian went on to beat much bigger engined two-strokes and big four-strokes to take that win on the day. And so I think it was Bert Greeves who named this model the Greeves Hoxton, because after that iconic win at Hoxton, it put Greeves on the world motorcycle map, and other manufacturers then stood up and took notice and realised that Greeves were a serious dirt bike manufacturer. So you can see that these early Greeves Hoxtons had this kind of leading link front suspension and these kind of paddle wheel brake drums that were designed to try and help cool the brakes. And because this is a 1961 Greeves, they were of course still using Villiers two-stroke engines to power their bikes, but it wouldn't be too long before Greeves would then develop their own engines for their scramblers, which I think happened around 1964. Although I have to say that I think this is probably one of the nicest and best restored examples of one of these Brian Stonebridge Hoxtons that I've seen in quite some time, and it's certainly a credit to its owner Ian Hodge, who's done an absolutely fantastic job of resurrecting this piece of British racing history. And of course, by doing so, Ian's managed to save it for future generations to enjoy. Anyhow, this is another little beauty that's been brought back to life by Ian's very talented hands, and this is his 1966 MX3 Greeves 250 Challenger, which, as I mentioned previously, if you're of a certain age and do remember when back in the day you used to be glued to your TV to watch the BBC Grandstands Winter Scrambles, then this bike here is more or less the machine that you'd be able to see many of those top British scramble stars riding. And you had the likes of riders like Alan Clough and Vic Eastwood, Dave Bickers, and of course many more who'd be riding these lightweight two-strokers against some of the big single-cylinder four-strokes of their day. And the commentary on those live scrambles broadcasts were usually supplied by the late and great Murray Walker. And in this shot here, you can see that by 1966, Greeves were now building their own engines for their bikes, and at the back it was the very basic of suspension systems, which is why you used to see these old scramblers bouncing all over the track, which never seemed to bother the riders at all at that time, because in reality there wasn't really much of an alternative to these suspension systems, so you just had to make do with what you had. But again, a fiberglass fuel tank and side panels, and our MX3 Challenger even has the original handlebars and controls that it was fitted with in 1966, which, as you can imagine, is a very rare thing to find on a bike of this age. But nevertheless, this is a superb pair of old Greeves classics, as I said, fully restored by their owner Ian Hodge. So a very big well done to you, Ian. You've certainly made a great job of preserving these old classics for future generations to enjoy. But we will make another return to the Greeves Riders Association stand sometime later in this Telford 2025 series of videos. But moving on to the pre-65 motocross club stand, who always seem to have some quite nice bikes on their display each year. And this lovely Rickman Villiers, or Rickman with what looks like possibly a Stormer or Villiers Star Maker engine, in the chassis is another one of those nice Rickman Matisse frame kits that you can buy and then simply fit your own engine, forks, rear suspension and wheels and all of the other small parts to finish off your particular bike. But this example here is a nice looking piece of kit, all done up in this British racing green colour scheme. Now, this was another bike that I did film on the Friday afternoon before the show opened proper on the Saturday. So at the time I took these pictures, there was no information supplied with the bike, so I can't give you a definitive year of manufacture or exactly who owned or rode the bike. Although it's suffice to say that this is another very popular bike with pre-65 riders, and I'll wager that quite a large proportion of the pre-65 riders will probably maybe race a Rickman Matisse or something like this, or maybe even a big single-cylinder or twin-cylinder four-stroker, because these old 1960s Rickmans are still very highly sought after among pre-65 racers. But as I said, another good example of one of these Rickman Matisse Scrambles two-strokers. So this was another nice classic bike that was on display on the pre-65 Motocross Club's stand. This was a nice BSA, which again I know absolutely nothing about, as the club members were still in the process of setting out their stall for the weekend when I grabbed these clips. But it looks at first glance that it might be powered by either a B44 or possibly a B50 BSA power plant. But as you can see, it's a fine looking piece of kit, and again, absolutely perfect for pre-65 racing. Now, although filming the bikes during setup on the Friday is quite a good thing in terms of being able to access and look around individual bikes, the downside is that usually the owners are too busy doing other things and they can't really spare the time to tell you all about individual machines. And also, there's normally no information cards placed besides the bikes at this time. So the Friday filming does have its pluses and minuses in each respect, although if you take a contrasting shot here from the Saturday on show day, you can see that the bikes are now more tightly packed together than before, and access to take pictures or video clips is now quite limited. But nevertheless, a nice collection of bikes here from the pre-65 Motocross Club. Now, if you're into your classic trials bikes, then you'd certainly be spoilt for choice when you came across some of the bikes that were on display on the Drayton Frames site, and they had a cracking selection of balance bikes, and this Drayton framed BSA Bantam was just one of their bikes that caught my eye. And the reason that I've actually got an attraction to these little Bantam motors is that it always brings back great memories of when I bought my first stripped down D1 Bantam from a pal for, I think it was just about £9 in the early 1970s, and then I ran around the local fields with the bike thinking that I was a scramble star from back in the day. But of course that was until I took the bike home for the very first time with both myself and the bike absolutely covered in mud, where of course my dad then went absolutely ballistic and he ordered me to give the bike back. But there were still great days and great times. But at the risk of repeating myself, as I've done many times in the past, I'm not really up to speed with all things trials, so I'm certainly not the guy to speak to if you want to know what's what on one of these Drayton framed trailers, but it's suffice to say that their chassis and all the upgrades that they fit to these Bantam motors is super high quality, and of course well engineered. And if you're maybe in the market for a retro styled classic trials Bantam, then Drayton we're offering up this little beauty here for just 6.5 off your finest British pounds, and it even comes with its V5 registration document so that you can register it for the road. But again, another super high quality and I have to say fantastic looking piece of kit, and who wouldn't want this little particular Bantam chicken in their workshop. But anyhow, the Drayton frames guys also had this very nice Tiger Cub 200 four-stroker on their stand, another nice Triumph engined trials bike, which again has some very nice trick custom parts fitted onto it. Now, I'm unsure if this is actually Drayton who make these lovely alloy fuel tanks, but they all seem to be a kind of standard size and shape across the range, and you can see that they're superbly crafted as well. And this one here has been decked out in the British Union Jack flag, and quite rightly so, because it's a British built bike. But I suspect that this little Tiger Cub here's engine also has had a few upgrades from its standard setting, but there was no information supplied with the bikes on the Friday afternoon when I shot these clips. But as you can see, as the Brits have done in the past, they're still building quite high quality motorcycles, just as they did back in the 1950s, 60s and 70s. And this modern interpretation of the old Tiger Cub is all the proof that you need. And in fact, the high quality engineering continues on the Drayton frames corner with this lovely Villiers two-stroke engined example, which is yet another variation of power plant that the Drayton factory can supply a chassis for. So I'm assuming that if you have a particular engine in mind to build a trials bike around, then I'm assuming that the engineers at Drayton will be able to build you a frame suitable for it. And as I said, you just can't help but admire the quality and the construction that goes into building these retro trials bikes. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm certainly not a trials fanatic, but I can still appreciate the engineering that goes into putting these machines together. So although I'm not able to supply you with all of the intricate details of some of the parts and specifications on these Drayton motorcycles, I'm pretty sure that they'll have some kind of website on the internet where you can find all of the information that you require. Although just before we leave the Drayton frames display, this was another belter of a bike that I spotted in their lineup, and this one here's powered by that lovely Triumph twin four-strokers. So a bit of comparison to the lighter two-stroke Villiers and Bantam engine, and of course that single-cylinder 200 cub motor as well. But again, a thing of beauty, no matter what kind of angle you view this bike from. But in terms of the engine's CCs, this Triumph Twin here will probably maybe be a 350 or a 500, because I don't think it'll be the big 650, which might be a bit too heavy for trials use. But of course, all of you Triumph fans out there will just take one look at this motor and then immediately start shouting back at your TV with the definitive answer. But for the likes of myself, with my limited Triumph and trials bike knowledge, I'm only really guessing in that regard. But nevertheless, another superb piece of workmanship from the Drayton Frames factory, and those 4 examples that you've seen there were just a small sample of what these guys had on display. Okay, so just to conclude this episode 1 of our visit to Telford 2025, we're going to have a quick gander around some rather exotic Beamish Suzukis, beginning with this absolutely stunning RL250, which I have to say looks even better than it did when this bike was sitting on the Suzuki dealership floor in the late 1970s. Now, the history of Beamish and Suzuki, I think, dates back to about the middle of the 1970s, when the original factory-made RL250s weren't exactly setting the world on fire with regards to their specifications and performance. And it was Graham Beamish, who was a former BSA Works rider, who took on the task of modifying these RL250s to make them better by doing all manner of upgrades and re-engineering some of the component parts, which in the end made these bikes a much more user-friendly machine, which Graham Beamish not only did on these RL250 trial bikes, but some of Suzuki's motocrossers as well. But if you want to know the full story of Graham Beamish and his relationship with Suzuki, then take a look at the Owners Club website here at beamishownersclub.com just to get the full story. So with regards to this particular RL250, this was another one of the bikes that I captured on the Friday afternoon. So at that time, again, there was not really any information posted alongside the bike on the day. But you don't need me to tell you that there's been quite a lot of time, money and hard work gone into building this bike to present it in this kind of condition. And if ever there was an award at Telford that was given out for the shiniest bike at the show, then this RL250 would certainly be a contender. But in its stock standard form, this RL250 piston port two-stroker was a decent enough engine, but of course Graham Beamish made it a lot better when he worked his magic over this engine. And as I remember, this motor here had a 5-speed gearbox, so it had enough speeds for you to do slow, intricate trials work, and also had a couple of decent gears for use on the open road. Although my guess is that this bike here is just a full-on show bike, because there's just far too much chrome and some nice shiny bits in there to get dirty if it was actually used at an off-road event. But then again, I've absolutely no problem at all with somebody using an old classic just to take to concourse or show bike events, because I think it's much more important that we can still take a look at these kind of machines rather than having them all locked away under cover where nobody can actually see them. But without doubt, this RL250 is an absolute stunner, and it's a credit to the owner who put in all the hard work to present it at this kind of level. And it's not every day that you see a Beamish RL250 Suzuki, let alone one in this kind of condition. And one other reason that these Beamish bikes are actually here at Telford this year is that the club are now celebrating their 50th anniversary of the Beamish brand, and what better way to honour it than displaying a collection of Graham Beamish's finest creations. And I expect that if Graham was actually still around here in 2025, I'm pretty sure that he'd approve of the few examples that we've got here. But our final Beamish RL 250 here belongs to Lee Thornton, which, as you can see, is another quite good example of one of these rare Beamish race bikes. And again, as to which year of manufacture it is for this bike, I'm guessing that it might be the middle to the late 1970s for this one here. Although it never ceases to amaze me just how some of these bikes are turned out at Telford each year, because many of them are in so much better condition than they were when they were first removed from their packing crates back in the day. And this featured RL 250 is yet another beauty that was sitting proud on the Beamish Owners Club stand. And it looks like this engine that's in this RL is one of the later reed valve motors, as opposed to that earlier piston port one that we saw in the previous bike. So once again, it's quite rare to see these Beamish Suzukis again, because I vaguely remember seeing one or two of the Beamish Suzuki Twinshock Scramblers in the 1970s, which you almost never see in this modern day now. So to be able to see a nice collection of these Beamish trials bikes is certainly a treat for the eyes and, of course, the memory. So it's almost certainly a big pat on the back to the Suzuki Beamish Owners Club for bringing along these half dozen or so examples for everybody to take a look at. And as I remember, these were very popular with the Telford crowds over the course of the weekend. Right, so these are just a sample of what you can expect to see coming up in episode 2. So if you haven't already made the move and subscribed to my CDB TV channel, then now would be a very good time to do that, because that way you won't miss out on any of my future postings from the Telford Show 2025. So once again, thanks for taking the time to watch, and we'll speak again when we return for episode 2 from Telford 2025.